We mentioned yesterday that because Avram asked a certain question, immediately we find the brisbane absurd in the come between the parts where Hashem says to Avram Avinu, Geri Yizaracha Beretz Lo Lohem, your children will be strangers in land which is not theirs. Va'avodum v'inem osam, they'll be enslaved, they'll be afflicted for 400 years. So Rashi cites the Chazal that the 400 years began to be counted from the birth of Yitzchak. From the birth of Yitzchak till we left Egypt, it was 400 years. So we discussed the morale. In what way was it? Did we experience bondage, affliction? So we'd mentioned. Now, it's interesting over here, the Midrash tells us exactly this Chazal which Rashi cites. Although Hashem said to Avram, they'll be enslaved and they will be afflicted for 400 years. Hashem had said to him, your children will be strangers. I mean, from the moment you have zera, the moment you have progeny, that's when the clock starts ticking. Mishnah like Yitzchak. From the moment Yitzchak was born, that's when the clock starts ticking to the 400 years. And from the 8 days of Milah, counting the 8 days of Milah, he was the first to be circumcised. Lishmona. Avram was circumcised at the age of 99, but the first person to be circumcised at the age of 8 days old was Yitzchak. Shenemar, Vayamal Avram Yitzchak b'no ben shmonas yomim. Avram circumcised Yitzchak, his son, when he was 8 days old. Now this is important. The Ficha Korlo HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shem. Therefore, because he was the first one to be circumcised at the age of 8 days old, therefore Hashem called him by name. Meaning, Rashi, one interpretation, when it says over there, who called Yitzchak Hashem, Vav Yaakov HaKadosh Baruch Hu Korlo Shem. This midrash is interesting. The midrash says Yaakov was also called by Hashem. Yaakov. Shenema v'yikro shmo Yaakov. It says, and he called his name Yaakov. Does say who? So Rashi, on that pasuk, says the first pshat, Yikro Yaakov HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The other pshat Rashi brings, his father called him Yaakov. But the first pshat is V'yikra lo, v'yikra shmo. Yaakov is Hashem. If you take a look at the Balaturim there, it says V'yikra shmo, v'yikra b'gematria Avram. That Avram is the one who actually called Yaakov, which is a whole discussion. Okay, but according to the Chazal, so Yitzchak was called Yitzchak by Hashem. He was the first to be circumcised on the 8th day, and Yaakov was also called by Hashem, Yaakov. Now, what is the significance of the name Yaakov? Well, what lies within the name? We know Yaakov was the most special of the patriarchs. Yaakov Arba Osios, Yeshbo. The 4 letters in Yaakov's name. Keneged Arba Ator Shabbat of Machid L'Kodesh Baruch Hu. It corresponds to the 4 levels of distinction that Klal Yisrael gave to Hashem. What are they? Or what we're associated with? Yud Keneged Aser Sadibros. The Yud of Yaakov corresponds to the Eser Dibros. Ayin. The Ayin Keneged Shivim Zakenim. There were 70 elders. Kuf. The letter Kuf. Keneged Hechol. Shebonu Bonov. By Kodesh Baruch Hu. That corresponds to the covered sanctuary, which his children had built for God's sake. Shegovo Me'amo, which were 100 amos in height. Shenemba V'Hechol Me'amo, quotes the posting in Cheskel, that the Hechol was 100 in height. Beis, the Beis of Yaakov, Keneged Shtei Haluchos. That corresponds to the 2 tablets. The Yud is the Aser Sadibros, that's as many as Dibros were on the Aser, on the 2 tablets. But the 2 Beis U'b'schus Yaakov nigalu Mitzrayim. And in the merit of Yaakov, we were redeemed from Egypt. Shenemar ve'Amidah lo Yaakov l'chok. Okay? So what encapsulates the totality of what the value of the person of Klal Yisrael, what they are versus a relationship with Hashem, what lies within Yaakov, Aser Sadibros, which encompasses the Torah in its entirety. Kuf is the Heichel, the height of the Heichel, which is atonement. Ain's the Kagan, and Beis. Therefore, so when Hashem, we say that what lies in the name always, the destiny of a person lies in the name. The name reveals what the potential of that person is, what lies in the person. Who identified Yaakov as Yaakov? To validate him and quantify him to be who he was, Hashem named him Yaakov. Because within the name Yaakov, there are 4 letters, and each one of the letters establishes the value of existence and the purpose of existence to be able to facilitate it and bring it about, which is what each one of the letters stands for. Now, it's interesting. Avram was also named by Hashem Avram, right? Hashem says, your name will no longer be Avram, it'll be Avraham. Avraham. We've mentioned, I asked the question, I asked this when I was in Israel. We find that we only assumed the status of Adam at Sinai. That means Avram was not Adam. That was not his classification. He was a Ben Noach. We only assumed the position, the equivalent of Adam Arishon at Sinai, where we had this expanded, unlimited potential of spirituality. But yet we find that Avraham Avinu, his innate qualities, which are Rachmanim, Baishanim, Gomeli Chasodim, that's part of the spiritual DNA of Klal Yisrael. As a result of what happened with the Achnosis Orchim, when he hosted the angels, every detail of that hospitality became part of the tapestry of the Jewish people. Down in the Yaakov, which correspond to Hishon Tachs Eitz, the water was the bear in the meat, bear shel Miriam. The bread is the mun. When he ran and he was bleeding, that had to do with the Korban Pesach and the Korbanos on Yom Kippur. But he's not even though he's the founding father of the Jewish people, he's not Adam. So I'd mentioned, there's an argument between Reb Shimon and the Chachomim. If a non-Jew contaminates, if you're under the same roof of the non-Jew, the remains of the non-Jew, is it only a Jew or even a non-Jew? Smachlokus. The Chacham say that a non-Jew only contaminates only upon contact. If you're under the same roof with a non-Jew, you're not contaminated. That's Rav Shimon Yochai. Rav Shimon Yochai says that. The Chacham say no, that even a non-Jew. Rav Shimon Yochai says, because it says, Zosa Torah Odom Kiyoms Ba'oel, Atem Kriyim Odom. If you're an Odom, it's Metabi Bo. A non-Jew is not called Odom, he's not Metabi. So Tosfos asks a question. The Gemara says in Rav Basra that there was an Amora, his name was Rabbano. He went to the Mars Machpelah, and he went to identify on top of the cave exactly where the remains of Avram were beneath. Because if a Kohen would go over that area, he shouldn't become contaminated. So he went into the cave to see exactly where Avram was. So Tosfos asks a question. Even though we find an argument between Rav Shimon and the Chachomim, if the remains of a non-Jew contaminates in oil, that's only after Sinai. But a Ben Noach before Sinai, everybody agrees, only contaminates only through direct contact, not through oil, not being over it. So why did Rabbi Noah have to identify the location of the remains of Avram within the cave It's before Sinai. That's Tos's question. So Tos's answer is that although Klal Yisrael did not assume the status of Odom until Sinai, but he cites a pasuk that Avram Avinu is referred to as Odom HaGodol. He already had the status of Odom even before Sinai. And because he was Odom, everybody agrees that his remains would contaminate. His status, his classification was not Ben Noach. His status was what? Was Odom. As a result of that, Rabbanoi had to identify exactly where the remains of Avram are within the cave. So the Kohen who passes over on top of the cave, he should not become contaminated. So we assume the profile of what Odom at Sinai, because Avram was the ultimate Odom, and because of that, we had the potential to evolve into Odom at Sinai. Therefore, the innate characteristics that he had, Rahman and Baishon, Gomli Chasodim, and all his actions, whether it's the Anei HaKavod, Barachnosis Orchim, or the Bereshel Miriam, or the Mon, or the Korban Pesach, whatever it was, what he did, that impacts and determines the future of Sinai. Because he already had that representation of Odom. That's the way I understand it. Now, when did he assume that status of Odom? When did he become that Odom? When was he given the land? The land is his and his progenies when he became circumcised. Your name will no longer be Avram, it'll be Avraham. So who named Avram Avraham? Avraham, when he became Avram, he became Odom. That's when he became Odom. That's when he became the Odom HaGodol. When Kadosh Baruch Hu, when Hashem created Adam, who called him Adam? Hashem called him Adam. Adam being the first human being of representing purpose. Hashem named him. He quantified it. Who quantified it as Avram to be Odom, even before Sinai? Hashem called him Avram. But Yitzchak, he had no other name other than Yitzchak. Who called him Yitzchak? Hashem called him Yitzchak. Who called Yaakov Yaakov? When he was born, Hashem called him Yaakov. Because Yaakov encapsulates the totality of Klal Yisrael. Yud is Aser Sadibros, Ayin is Ayin Zekanim, Kuf is Gova Heichel, the height of the Heichel in the base of Mikdash, and Beis is Shnei Luch Sabris. And he says, and therefore, in the Schus of Avram, we redeemed from Egypt. Even though we say it's Shloshim Lishonam, we retained our language, our dress, our names. It's true. If we wouldn't have that, we would have gone into the oblivion. But what was the spiritual makeup of Klal Yisrael? What was the DNA of Klal Yisrael? The DNA of Klal Yisrael was what? Was Yaakov. Our essence, Yaakov encapsulated Aser Sadibros, Shnei Luch Sabris, Kapora, which is the Gova Eichel, the height of the sanctuary, and Ayin Zekanim, which represents the Torah of Klal Yisrael, which is the Sanhedrin. Pasuk Ches Parsha Shmos. V'yokam melech chodosh al Mitzrayim. A new king arose over Egypt, Hashem Yodas Yosef, who did not know Yosef. So Rashi cites him in the argument in Rav and Shmuel. Charam Chodesh Mamash means literally a new king. The old king died. There's a new king. Charam Shenischachim Zerosov, meaning there was a new mandate. He did not act as the original Paro acted. He assumed a new profile in terms of the way he dealt with the Jews. What's Hashem Yoda? According to that, so what I mean, if it was the old king, what does Hashem Yoda? It was a new mandate. Also, Yoda. He behaved as if he didn't know Yosef. So the question is, meaning his actions, you can only behave that way, everybody has a conscience. So if you didn't know a person, okay, you hear things. They say, but if it's the same king, and he knows that firsthand, with all the interaction, that Yosef saved Egypt, and if not for Yosef, there would not be in Egypt. How do you behave this way? He had the ability to suppress that. The whole past, he suppressed it, and therefore he acted as if Yosef never existed. And therefore, there was no issue of conscience with this Paro. I once asked the question, we find that when Paro became aware that Yosef had come to Egypt, the Torah tells us, this is in Parshas Vayigash, it says, Vayitav be'enei Paro be'enei avodav. It found favor in the eyes of Paro and his inner circle. Shebo achei Yosef, that Yosef's brothers came. So Rashi says Chazal, why? Because until then, Paro had a problem with Yosef. Yosef was the viceroy. He wore royal garments. He had a position in the government. And according to the protocols of Egypt, a person who was a slave, who was not from royalty, wasn't qualified to be in his position. And they were always sniping at Paro, says, how do you do this? So Paro would always silence him, saying, he comes from royalty. He's not a slave. He was kidnapped. And he would give him the story. But when it was revealed that Yosef's brothers came, that these are Yosef's brothers, and it became public knowledge that he's truly from royalty, they were ecstatic, because now these issues of questioning who Yosef is no longer a question. That's Chazal. What does Paro say? He says to Paro, tell your father that he should leave everything that he amassed in Canaan, leave it there, just come himself. We're going to re-outfit him when he comes to Egypt. But what does the Torah tell us? When Yaakov came, everything he had amassed in Egypt, everything, he brought to Mitzrayim. I mean, Paro is magnanimous. He gives him re-outfit, resettle you, no problem. You see an unlimited level of generosity of Paro, and Yaakov didn't want to benefit. See, similar, he brought whatever he had, right? All his personal effects, all his assets, he brought to Egypt. Everything. The Torah makes it a point, brought everything. So Paro, in terms of his behavior, and we're talking about it's the same Paro. I mean, how could a person have this schizophrenic personality? First he's this, and all of a sudden he becomes a monster. Not only does he treat them second class, he enslaves them. And he's able to behave as if he never knew Yosef. How do you behave this way? To a point he has no conscience. After displaying such level of givingness, that's the question we once asked. We find that when Yaakov was transferring his family over the Yabok River, and he realized that he had forgotten something behind, and it says, "Vayivose Yaakov levado." Yaakov was left all by himself, and all of a sudden, he was attacked by this Malach, who was the archangel of Esav. So the Gemara in Chulin asks, what did he go back for? He went back for Pachim Ketanim, and we see the wealth of Yaakov just from the gift he had sent to Esav. And why did he go back? Pachim Ketanim, earthenware, small earthenware vessels. That's what he went back for. Does it make sense? Let it go. And was Yaakov a penny pincher? What is it all about? So the Gemara tells us, what's the takeaway? That tzaddikim chavivim mamonim yosim yufon. That a tzaddik, he values his money, his assets, like he values his life. Why? Because a tzaddik will not justify things that an ordinary person would justify. This is the way Rashi explains the Gemara Chulin. An ordinary person says, something, I'm an ethical, moral person, but if I have to steal for survival, I steal. Yaakovinu is of the position that if Hashem gives him anything, it's there for a purpose. And therefore, whatever you have, you can't totally belittle and not value, because you never know when you may need that. So therefore, tzaddikim chavivim mon yosim yikufa. If Hashem gave it to you, He endowed it to you, whatever its worth is, even though it has very little worth, you value it. That's the reason why Yaakov went back for the Pachim Kitanim. That's Gemara Chulin. Okay? That's the Jewish perspective. That's what we learn from Yaakov. What about the Gentile perspective? The Gemara says in Avodah Zarah, it speaks about the Roman legions when they would traverse the desert, and you go through the desert, you'd find all kinds of pottery, all types of dishes, and you would find, what was the question? The question was, you would find these little discs of pottery, and if you wanted to have wine in the desert, you had water, wanted to have wine, what they do? Before they would begin traveling, they would take these discs of pottery, they weren't glazed, and they would soak it in wine. Soak it. So this disc of pottery is saturated with wine. So when they'd be in the desert, if they want to drink wine, and it was undiluted wine, they would soak it in water, and by soaking the water, the wine would be extracted from the disc, and they'd be able to drink wine wherever they were. That's the Gemara in Avodah Zarah. So the whole question is Yain Nesach, you're not permitted to benefit, but it says when they would go through it, they find strewn all over the desert dishes and all kinds of pottery of the Romans. Rome ruled the world supreme. The Romans, wherever they went, they didn't have to take what they had when they went from place to place. Wherever they went, they reestablished themselves. Everything was replaced. What is that? What is that an indication of? That's power. Power is, I don't inconvenience myself. I am the master. The subject provides for the master. When it comes to the Jewish perspective is, if Hashem gives you something, you have to value it. Because you never know when you may need that. So Paro says to Yosef, he understood who Yosef was. He understood who he was. We find that Yosef, when his family came, there's a beautiful Siforno, it says he fed his family lefi hatov, according to the mouths of the young children. What is lefi hatov? So the Siforno says normally when you give a child food to eat, the good part of it is just wasted. Wasted. That's a child. Since it was famine years, even though Yosef was the viceroy and he had control over unlimited amounts of food, even his own family, he only gave them enough food, only what the children actually needed. He did not give them more than was needed to be wasted. That's how exacting Yosef was. He did not abuse his power to any degree. And Paro understood this. He understood the behavior of Yosef. So what happens? Here, he just won a prize. It's been found out that Yosef is royalty. All his issues are no longer issues. They're not going to snipe him any longer. That Yosef is a slave. All of a sudden, his family shows up with all the personal effects. They brought everything from Egypt. The pots, the pans, everything. They said, what's going on over here? This is royalty. This is a person who comes from an impoverished background. So Paro, when he said, I'm going to re-outfit you, give you everything, leave everything behind, it wasn't an indication of his magnanimous, unlimited level of generosity. This was for self-interest, had nothing to do with this. So whatever is his self-interest, that's the way the wheel turns. Now his self-interest is because he feels threatened by the Jews, he enslaves them. So there's no change, there's no schizophrenia over here. Everything is the self-centeredness of Paro. Before, for his own sake, I will re-outfit you. Now, for his own sake, I'm going to enslave them. It's the exact same characteristic before, and now nothing has changed.
Just so I understand, he was in.
What do they call it? The G, when all the heads of state meet and they talk economies. The G, whatever they call it. G, what's it called?
G7 and the G20.
Yeah. So they used to have kings. They used to get together, and they would talk about many things. David HaMelech, he was the king. David conquered Israel almost totally himself. He handed it to Shlomo on a silver platter. The Gemara tells us that when David went to war, he would shoot one arrow, and that one arrow would pierce 700 of the enemy. He didn't have he didn't need a big budget for defense. One arrow was like a tomahawk. Went through 700 people. And David felt that the Jews were not at the right level. Why? Because it says in the Tochacha, before the Tocha, that if you follow my ways, one of you will pursue 1,000 of the enemy. 1,000. His arrow only killed 700. So he felt he wasn't where they should be. Of course, if they were where they should be, the arrow should have killed 1,000, not 700. So David was renowned. So when he came to these summits of the kings, he said, so whatever we talk about, their glory, their conquests, their harems, all this kind of stuff they talk about. You know what David spoke about? I spoke about your testaments and I was not embarrassed. I spoke about spirituality. I didn't speak about what they spoke about. You understand? But they couldn't say anything because David was David. Because he was always the victor. But what did he talk about? This archaic Jews talking about all this so-called nonsense. So when David spoke and when they spoke worlds that they weren't within the same realm of existence. I speak about your testament and I'm not embarrassed. Not embarrassed. I was like a stone in their presence. No embarrassment. I know what it's all about. I have everything. What they're talking about nonsense. It's like you go to a meeting and all they're talking about is what? Is perversion. And then you speak about values. You're going to be embarrassed. You speak about values, but they're talking about everything that's the most extreme level of perversion. Of course not. That's David. That's the way he saw the world. But David wasn't fazed by this. Yaakov is Yaakov. He's bringing his value system, he's bringing to Egypt. But his value system, the Egyptian value system, is the world apart. It's not even within the same realm of existence. And Pharaoh understood this. So now, Yosef saved the day. Not for Yosef, they want to be in Egypt. He behaved as if he suppressed it to such a degree, like Yosef never did anything for them. It's literally a heartlessness. Here. He said to his people, Hine am Bnei Yisrael, behold, the nation of Bnei Yisrael, Rav Otzim Imenu, they're more numerous and also more powerful than we are. Why they Rav is obvious, as it says, Vayishutzu. Each birth was six in each birth, 6 in each litter. What's for Otzum? They're more powerful. How do you see they're more powerful? I mean, the Jews, did they walk around the streets showing their control or their ability to control people? It was separate. What do you mean they're Otzum? It means seemingly they have a level of empowerment which is one of a kind. You know, what binds people? What creates unity with people? Identity. If people, they have the same language, the same dress, same value system, that means each one is committed to the other. They're not fractionalized. Firstly, quantitatively, the numbers are out of control. In addition, also, they're empowered. Why? Because they have one perspective. They have one level of identity. And because of that, that's the unifying factor that literally they're uncontrolled. You cannot control these. You cannot suppress them. Rashi cites Chazal that during the Regalim, when Gentiles would come to Yerushalayim and they would see how the Jews celebrated the Regel, they were so overwhelmingly impressed they would convert to become Jews. Why? Because among the Gentiles, they had multiple deities they used to worship. They had multiple cuisines, different kinds of food they ate. But the Jews, when they come there, they have one God, they have one high priest, they have one dietary system, everything's one. The unification of the Jews was so overwhelmingly impressive. No fractionalization. That caused them to be so attracted that they could become Jews. So there was always, what was displayed was always that same thing. I always say, in Poland was anti-Semitic. Going back, Jews were in Poland for 1,000 years. The Jews themselves, the only reason why they were able to survive Poland is because the landlords, they needed the Jews to oversee their estates. But in terms of the anti-Semitism was always at a very extreme level in Poland. And therefore, there were all kinds of decrees and things that they imposed upon the Jews that they didn't impose upon the populace, the non-Jewish population. But what could they tolerate? Here we put the Jews in advice. It comes Shabbos, it comes to the holidays, the Jew behaves like a king. Behaves like a king. He sits at his table. It's like whatever, it's like the Polish people don't exist. They live within their own so-called, their own cocoon, their own world. Here we're trying to make them feel second, third class, and they behave like royalty. It literally, they cannot tolerate it. And they saw it as a level of arrogance. This only inflamed the anti-Semitism, even more so. You guys have nothing. How do you behave this way? This is total arrogance. But the Jew held, because the Jew understood what the Pole was. He was a subhuman being. That's what he was. The way he behaved, the way his action, everything he was subhuman. We were royal. And they behaved like royalty. Rav Otzim, numerous is obvious. Otzim, they're empowered. The behavior, the unification, the value systems, it's all the same. That's the most dangerous. These people are going to be uncontrollable. The level of empowerment they have, we have to do something about it. We have to suppress it. We have to put them in shackles. And that was the whole concept of the bondage, the slavery.
Rabbi, I mean, it sounds like
in the Holocaust, and he speaks and he goes that throughout history, whenever we went into exile and whenever we really felt the pain, Jews started to toe the line and become more observant. But as we went into societies, and the Jews are very capable and qualified and gifted, and we started to climb the financial ladder. As we climbed that financial ladder, we began shedding our Jewish identity, observance-wise, in every sense of the word. And we reached the height of power in the material. That's when we were pushed off the cliff. And this repeats itself over and over and over again. And he concludes, Ramesh wrote this in the early part of the 20th century. And he says, the next tochacha is Berlin, Germany. Why? Because the Jews in Berlin say that Jerusalem of the Jews is Berlin. He says, therefore, the next Holocaust is Germany. That's what Ramesh wrote at the beginning of the 20th century in the tochacha on Parshas B'chokosai. You can download it, Google it, whatever you want to call it. That's what he writes. And in that same piece, he tracks the cycles of Jews, our advancement in society and how we fell, and how each one's linked to our level of observance and identity as Jews.